Hey, quick note before we start. I totally forgot to mention. I had meant to mention my friend Gregory Ambrose in the teaching because he noticed something that I hadn't even given a thought to. You know, he said, well, a lot of people don't like Hanukkah. He said, well, why? If Jesus didn't like Hanukkah, wouldn't he have said something when he was there in the temple in John chapter 10, when we know that when he was angry in the temple, he was like flipping over tables and whipping people? Certainly, if something pagan or horrible or something he didn't approve of or God didn't approve of was going on in the temple, he'd be making a whip. He didn't, so he must like Hanukkah. Anyway, here is a book that I want to tell you guys about because you can get it really cheap used, like on Amazon, and sorry for the earthquake action going on here. I have my laptop on my lap. I'm getting ready to edit the video for this week. So, Hanukkah Anthology. Rabbi Philip Goodman, he has a lot of really cool information. You can get these used and cheap. And he has one on all the different feasts. And I have all of them. They are awesome. Anyway, on with the teaching. I'll see you in just a minute.
Hi, I'm Miss Tyler, and welcome to Context for Kids, New Testament Backgrounds number 5, and this is actually Hanukkah, part 3. We talked about the temple and the sacrifices the last 2 weeks, but for the next few weeks we're going to talk about the Maccabean Revolt and the first Hanukkah, because it's a very important piece of New Testament background. Without Hanukkah, there would be no Yeshua, no Jesus, no Messiah. It'd be a very bad world indeed. So it was all part of God's plan. It's really interesting how it came about. Okay, so I don't usually tell you our sources, but I'm going to tell you these sources because these are free online. Your family can look them up. No big deal. I don't like to give you ones that, my normal ones that cost like $50 a piece. But if you ever want to know my sources, just email me. Okay, so first Maccabees, it was written sometime after 134 BC because that was the last event that was detailed. We have it in Greek. It was originally written in Hebrew. We can tell because there's a whole bunch of Hebrew expressions that are just translated into Greek. If you back translate, it's like, oh, that's what that means. Not that I can do that. Okay, so it covers the dates from 175 to 134, and it was put in the Septuagint, which was a whole, we talked about last year, 70 or 72 great Jewish scholars who were fluent in both Hebrew and Greek. They translated the entire Hebrew scriptures into Greek. It's an authorized version, okay? And they did that ongoing project from the 2nd century into the 1st century BCE. Okay, then we have 2nd Maccabees. Now, 1st Maccabees is a straight-up history book. Okay, straight-up history book. 2nd Maccabees was written in the 1st century BC, so within the 100 years before the birth of Yeshua. Now, it's a letter to the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt. It was a huge Jewish community there. And it's got narrower. It covers 180 to 161 BCE. And it's more of an apologetic, encouraging the Jews there not to stop celebrating what's called in chapter 1 verse 9 the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Tabernacles, in the month of Kislev, which is different from the Feast of Tabernacles in the month of Tishri. That's the regular one we see in Leviticus 23. Now, why was it called the Feast of Dedication, the month of Kislev? Well, we'll find out about that, but not this week. So you got to stay tuned. All right, so now 2nd Maccabees was written in Greek. We know that. So, we've got the Gospel of John, chapter 10, and we're going to go to that in the next slide. And we've got Josephus, both his Antiquities and his Wars of the Jews, and I didn't put the specific things. I apologize, I forgot. Oh. Okay, so, a lot of people ask, well, did Yeshua celebrate Hanukkah? I don't see it in the New Testament. I don't see Paul celebrating it. I don't see any of the apostles celebrating it. Well, actually, yes, Yeshua did celebrate it. Here's John 10, verses 22 through 24. At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, Tishri's in the fall. Kislev's in the winter. And Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you're the Christ, tell us plainly." Okay, now there's a couple of things in here. Like I said, this is winter, so we know it's not the feast of Sukkot. It's the feast of dedication that happens in the winter in Kislev. Now that's Hanukkah. On Kislev 25 is when that starts. And Jesus was walking in the temple, so he's in the temple. That's where you celebrate feast. He was in the colony of Solomon, which is a very special place, and I'll show you that. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Why were they asking that? Well, because 2 months before, Yeshua had done something that only the prophesied Messiah would ever do, and that was heal a man born blind from birth. Now, you don't see that written out plainly in Scripture, but the Jewish scholars had looked at the Scripture, and based on what they saw, they decided that was going to be one of the signs of Messiah. And, well, there was only one who ever did it. That was Yeshua. All right. So, another one, people ask, did Yeshua approve of Hanukkah? Well, he was walking along Solomon's porch, which was part of the original Temple Mount. So that's very special, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And we also know that when Yeshua doesn't like things going on the Temple Mount, that he makes whips and turns over tables. We see no ruckus whatsoever. So, I'm thinking he's enjoying himself. Because, like all feasts, his father was being glorified and celebrated, and his great deliverance was being heralded, and they were praying and they were making special tribute sacrifices. We talked about those last week in the temple. It was like best day ever. Well, best day that month. All right. So, we know that Yeshua is not afraid to create a ruckus in the temple when people are disrespecting it. But he's not. He's there and he is celebrating the feast. All right. So, let's look at regions of holiness really quick. This is the Temple Mount. This is east. I apologize, it wouldn't fit the other way. North, west, south. Now, the original Temple Mount. The reason here's Solomon's porch. This is where Yeshua was walking. Okay? And it's very special that he was walking there. In the time of Solomon, the Temple Mount went from here to here to here to here. Okay? So we include the wall and go to about here, just barely behind, and then down, okay? Now, when the Herodians, these are the descendants of the Maccabees who we're going to be talking about next week, they are going to make the Temple Mount bigger, and they are going to make it longer. So they're going to take it from this, which is, Barclays Gate. And they're going to take it to here. And they're going to make it just a little bit longer. Okay? But then Herod's going to come along, and he is going to add this, and this, and this. And he's going to make these covered porticos. And this is the royal portico. This is where Yeshua was whipping the money changers and turning over their tables. This was the far end of the Temple Mount. This was as far as you could possibly get from God's temple, his actual sanctuary. So, this was far away. This is holier. This is the original Temple Mount. It's got special holiness. So, if he was upset over here about money changing, then if there was anything bad going on with the celebration all the way over here on the original Temple Mount, well, whips wouldn't have been cutting it. He would have been, I don't even want to know. It would have been ugly. It would have been ugly. But evidently he was there enjoying himself and celebrating, because that's what feasts were about. They were about celebrating God. They were about glorifying him. There we go. All right, so that's your little lesson on the Temple Mount for today. All right. So, how did the exile go? We're going to go back now because we've got to get to the point where we can understand why the Jews weren't ruling themselves at this time, because they weren't. They hadn't ruled themselves at the beginning of the Maccabean Revolt. They had not ruled themselves in hundreds of years, since 586 BCE. That was when Babylon destroyed the temple, like I said, and they took the rest of the Jews that were still remaining in the land that hadn't already been captured and taken into exile. They took them into Babylon and moved other people into the land. They left the very poorest there to work the land. Then the Medes and the Persians conquered the Babylonians. And in 539 BCE, Cyrus, who is actually prophesied, but one of the prophets actually called him by name and said, "Cyrus, my servant." Wow. My name's not in the Bible. Is your name in the Bible? If your name is in the Bible, are they talking about you, or is it a coincidence? I don't even rate to have somebody who has any of my names in there. Tyler, Don, Rosenquist. Not in the Bible. Dang. All right. So Cyrus sends them all back, and he also sends all the different peoples that he sends back, he sends them with money to build up their temples again, because he wants them praying to the national gods to bless his reign. He wasn't being, he wasn't being as benevolent as it would seem, but regardless of his motives, he did pay to have the temple rebuilt. The new temple was dedicated in 516 BCE, and then, you know what, we hear almost nothing for the next 200 years. Almost nothing. It's like the dark ages of history where there isn't a lot written down. It's just a strange thing. Okay, I mean, there are some things, but not a lot. It's kind of like this black hole of history. But we know they didn't die. They're still there, so couldn't have gone terribly bad. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great conquers that region. But he doesn't destroy Jerusalem because the high priest and all the elders, they had a vision and they went out to meet Alexander in all their pomp and finery, and they pretty much surrendered to him, and he just allowed them, he didn't do anything to them because he was so honored. Okay. Now, after the death of Alexander the Great, he divided his kingdom into 4 different kingdoms because he had no son. So he was dying. He didn't do it after his death. He did it before his death. And so he divided the kingdom into the hands of his 4 generals. 2 of those generals were founded the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. Ptolemies were over Egypt and the Holy Land, and then the Seleucids were over the Mesopotamia, Syria region. But they kept fighting back and forth because throughout history, everyone wants Israel. It's just the never-ending story. Now, that's kind of the dates, but how did the exile go? How was it for the Jews? Well, the Jews had almost complete religious freedom, with a few brief exceptions like Nebuchadnezzar erecting a big chocolate bunny, or oh wait, it was a gold statue of himself, wasn't it? And making everybody bow down to it, and Darius saying that everyone had to pray to him. And then, of course, there was Haman. You know, the evil Haman in the book of Esther that, we talk about at the time of Purim. But those were the minority. Polytheists are kind of cool to live around, but only for really one reason. And that reason is that polytheists generally didn't care what gods you were worshiping. They just, as long as you were worshiping somebody, they just saw it as another god. Well, of course there are other gods. They don't care that there are other gods. Their belief system is surrounded by, there are gods everywhere. And every country has its own gods. And this is not weird. So it wasn't weird that the Jews were worshiping this god they never heard of. They didn't care. They were a conquered people. Their gods won. That's the way they would see it. So they would allow the Jews complete religious freedom. And once the Jews were actually living in a polytheistic society, they finally snapped out of it, and they were never into paganism again. They just didn't. They became exclusive monotheists. They were horrified by the culture around it and by the way the kings of those countries behaved. And the horrible power they had over life and death and the horrible tortures. Oh, I could tell you stories. I won't, but I could. Anyway, so, how did the exile go? Well, it was a good thing. But, here's the thing. Exile was also really comfortable. It was hard for the people who went to live in Judea. Very hard. You know, it wasn't like their fathers' times. They were constantly fighting with the Samaritans. The nations around them were harassing them terribly. The temple wasn't as glorious as it had been before, and they were ruled by foreign powers. And that wasn't going to change for a long time. So, they were commanded to come back. Come out of her, my people, was actually spoken specifically to the Babylonian Jews. And God was telling them, look, I'm going to overthrow this empire. You need to, when you're freed, when the 70 years of exile is over, you need to come back home. That was his command. But life in Judea was very hard. It was dangerous. And so most Jews stayed wherever the Babylonians had planted them. And that was positive and negative because now there are centers for Jews all over the world. And the Torah is infiltrating into the world. That's a good thing. God wanted his word to be everywhere. Just not that way, but he also wanted his people not to be in the midst of such a horrible society. Religious freedom or not. Because when you have religious freedom, sometimes you turn a blind eye to other things. All right, so when you hear about Hanukkah, everybody talks about one guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, and he is the reason why I wore my Darth Vader shirt. See, here he is, Antiochus Epiphanes, and here's Demetrius, and, well, you know, all these, this can be Ptolemy. I don't know who that is. Well, I don't know. Joe. That's Joe. All right. So, just forget about me. I wrote too much book this week, and I'm brain dead. All right. So, and we kind of look at Antiochus Epiphanes, the guy who defiled the temple in Jerusalem and who tried to overturn the nation and made the laws of God illegal, as we'll find out next week. We look at him as the villain. But when you ask the Jews who the villains are, they say the Hellenized Jews. You see, they're the true bad guys of the Hanukkah story. Without them, Antiochus Epiphanes would never have done the things that he did. He only did it because, well, frankly, it looks like he was manipulated and cajoled. And, you know, he was used, actually, by these Jews who were not interested in being Jews. These Jews wanted gymnasiums. Did you know that in the gymnasiums those guys did their sports naked? Ain't nobody want to see that. No. Of course it was men only. I don't want to be there. Dang. Messed up. Okay, they had hippodromes. That's where they had the hippo races. Oh wait. Hippo is the Greek word for horse, isn't it? I guess that means they had the horse races there, the chariot races. Then they had the Colosseums. You know, where they had the gladiator fights. Spartacus. Great movie. Then they have the amphitheaters where they would have the dramas or the comedies. These were the benefits of living in a Hellenized city, and that's what these Jews wanted. They didn't want to be Jews. They didn't want to live pious lives. And they were a minority. But I don't know if you've ever noticed, when the minority wants to stir up trouble, they certainly seem like a lot more people than the majority does. So, they said, we want to be Greeks. And so let's tell Antiochus that we want to be just like him. There was a problem. And this was before they started messing with Antiochus. You see, first they just tried to convince the people of the nation that they should be Hellenized, that they should do things the Greek way with the Greeks. You know, that they shouldn't keep Jewish laws anymore. Jewish laws are drag, they say, you know. We're not having any fun. If we just do what the Greeks do, it's going to go a lot better for us. Everything will be great. We'll have favored nation status, and we'll get wealthy, we'll have tourism, all that kind of stuff. But it didn't work. You see, there was this group called the scribes, and we're talking about them a little today. We're going to talk about them later, but the scribes were like uber Bible teachers. That's what they were at this time. And they were so effective at teaching all the people. I mean, all of the little boys, you know, from the time you were like in kindergarten, you started studying the Bible full time, which is really cool, right? And they would do that until they got to be like 12. And then when they were 12, if they were really, really good students, they might get chosen as, you know, by a rabbi to follow in his footsteps. Like Yeshua, Jesus chose the disciples. You know, they were probably very young men. And by young men, I mean young teenagers who had been passed over by other rabbis. But anyway, the scribes had educated everyone and instilled everyone with such a love for God's word that they didn't want to become Hellenized. And for 100 years, none of these Jews that want to be Hellenized could make any headway. Nobody wanted anything to do with them. Now, during this time, all the surrounding nations, the Edomites, the Moabites, everybody who was, you know, all the old ites that were still left over, now they were becoming Hellenized. Boy, they just fell like dominoes. All right? And this was the time that they started saying, oh, well, this God that I have is kind of like that Greek God, and we really want to be Greek because they are so sophisticated. So we are going to equate our God with that God. See, a lot of people think it was that there was a common ancestor of all the gods, and then, you know, there was like, and they kind of evolved. But actually, it was the other way around. You had all of these different societies with all of their gods, and then when the Greeks came along, and everyone wanted to be like the Greeks, they identified their own gods with Greek gods because the Greek culture was so overwhelmingly amazing and sophisticated and artsy. It was very entertaining. It was all the cool kids are Greeks. Absolutely. All right. So, like I said, the surrounding nations, they were just doing everything Greek. You know, Jews were really pretty much the only holdouts at this time that I know of. Now, so everything was going great. They were holding out. They were sticking to the God's ways. They were keeping their own laws. They were worshiping God in His way, doing everything God wanted. The only real problem was that they were being, you know, they were in the middle of the war between Ptolemy and the Seleucids. Okay. Now, while they were still under the authority of Egypt, under the Ptolemies. By the way, did you know Cleopatra? She was a Ptolemy. Yeah, Cleopatra. Did you know Cleopatra is in the Bible? She's mentioned in the book of Daniel. That has actually a lot of things about Hanukkah, but we're not going to talk about it because that's prophetic stuff. But isn't that cool? Cleopatra's in the Bible. Oh my gosh, that's so cool. Anyway, okay, so the trouble begins, like I said, when the Egyptians are still over, and a Jew named Joseph ben Tobias, who was related to the current high priest, he became the tax collector for the Syrian province. Everything changed. You see, tax collectors in this day, and this is an important piece of New Testament context that I want you to understand, because Jesus talked about some people who aren't willing to, you know, play nice with others. He said, you know, if you've warned them enough times and they're just, you know, being goober heads, then treat them like a tax collector or a Gentile. So what was the problem with tax collectors? Is it like our IRS agents? No. The IRS agents are bound by laws to only take certain taxes at certain times, and there were no regulations for ancient tax collectors. You see, they had a certain amount they needed to collect. Anything extra they got went in their pocket. And nobody, as long as they brought in the money for the king that they were serving, nobody asked any questions. Nobody cared if the people were unhappy because, you know, they're just the people. You know, if they were important, then they'd be king, but they're not, so we don't care. So, you've got this guy related to the high priestly family at the time, and he's crooked. And he turns that family into an oligarchy, where the priesthood is, I mean, they've got a ton of money coming in. They've got the temple money. They've got the tax money coming in from the Syrian province. So, I mean, here's this guy. He's related to the high priest. He's got an army following him taking taxes. And so all the Gentile nations start hating the Jews. Is it because of all Jews? No, they're being oppressed too. Because of one Jew who was evil and very wicked and not collecting taxes fairly. And that's going to have long-lasting repercussions, because once those nations see that Judea is having hard times and they're getting picked on, all those nations are going to want revenge. And so it's amazing what effect one man can have on an entire nation. And that is all that we're going to do for this week. I hope you enjoyed that. This isn't my favorite thing to teach, I admit. It's war and that kind of stuff. I like to teach on single topics. But you know, with the Maccabean Revolt, there's just so much to cover and there's not a lot of time to do it in. So, I hope you did learn something today. Next week we're going to get into the actual war and what happened, and hopefully we will also get into the first Hanukkah. If we don't get into the first Hanukkah next week, we will definitely get into it the week after that. And, well, I hope that you learn a lot. I hope that you're really inspired to maybe keep Hanukkah this year. It's very exciting. It begins actually on December 24th this year at sundown. So we'll talk about that. Anyway, that's it. I love you. I'm praying for you. And I hope you have a wonderful week studying the scriptures together. And keep me in your prayers. We're getting ready to move to Idaho in less than a month now. And so I'm really, really busy. It's hard keeping everything together. But I'm very, very excited. And I'm hoping if any of you live in the Idaho or Montana or Wyoming or Utah region, I'd love to meet you guys. Anyway, y'all take care. Love you. Bye.